All right, Alexander, let's do an update as to what's going on in Ethiopia. In the last video we did, the situation was that the capital was surrounded, or was close to being surrounded by the Tigray forces, and things did not look good for the government in Ethiopia. But the latest update is that those forces have now been repelled, and this has taken place courtesy of drones which have been provided by Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. I mean, we kind of saw something similar like this, at least Turkish drones, with regards to Nagorno-Karabakh and the fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Once again, it looks like you have Turkish drones doing a lot of the heavy lifting and pushing back those Tigrayan forces. And now it looks like the government in Ethiopia is on the move and has the advantage here. What is the news coming out of Ethiopia now?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a dramatic turn of events. Now, can I just say a few things? I mean, it's become very clear over the last few weeks that the United States was quietly backing the Tigrayan forces, and it wasn't happy with Prime Minister Abiy's close friendship with certain countries, notably China, and this was part of it. There were obviously internal issues within this struggle, but there is also a geopolitical dimension to this conflict as well. And the Tigrayan forces, which were much better organized initially and had long experience of war, and the Tigrayan leaders had a long experience of insurgency war against the Ethiopian military government of the 1980s, the so-called the Derg. They were initially able to win battles against the Ethiopian army, basically smash the Ethiopian army as it had previously existed. And they advanced to Addis Ababa, and they created this coalition of groups from other ethnicities across Ethiopia. And it looked as if their plan was to capture Addis Ababa, set themselves up as the new government of Ethiopia, seek international recognition, which no doubt they were expecting to get from the US and Western countries, and basically change Ethiopia's geopolitical orientation. Now, this proved extremely unpopular with the Ethiopian government's backers, the current Ethiopian government's backers. And you've seen a rush by various countries, Turkey, possibly Iran, definitely the UAE, and it seems behind the UAE, China, to come to the Ethiopian government's rescue. And this took the form of drone supplies of drones. Now, some of these drones came from Iran. A very significant group of these drones, the TB2 Bayraktar drone, came from Turkey. It's the same drone that the Turks have used in the Nagorno-Karabakh fighting, and previously in Syria and in Libya. But also, perhaps even more important, have been the Wing Loon drones, which have been supplied by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and which ultimately come from China. And the important thing to understand about these drones is that the Turkish drones are quite small. They're light drones. They're drones that you can be used immediately. The correct place to do them is to use them immediately behind the front line to disrupt supplies and communications between the advancing troops, and disrupt their logistics. But the Chinese drones are more powerful and much more long-ranged, and they've been able to strike further back into the base areas of the Tigrayans. And it seems there were dozens of these drones operating at any one particular point. And the suggestion is, because it's inconceivable that the Ethiopians were able to train to use these drones so quickly, they must have had help from someone to do it. And that strongly suggests that there are operators, Turkish and UAE operators of these drones operating in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and they were able to break the back of the Tigrayan forces and force them back towards Tigray itself. And we've been hearing a whole series of reports now that the Tigrayan troops are basically withdrawing rapidly back into Tigray itself. Now, I should say that a few days ago, I finally had a discussion with a former official of the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which is now the ruling faction in Eritrea, which is allied with Ethiopia. And he's still in contact with people in Eritrea itself, in Asmara, the capital. And he tells me that what's now happening is that there is going to be another major offensive against Tigray. And he said the Ethiopians are rapidly building up very large armed forces from all the various nationalities and ethnicities of Ethiopia. And Eritrea itself is now moving armored units towards the border with Tigray. And he was talking about a force of 1 million men being thrown at Tigray. Now, I one has to take all of that with a massive mountain of salt. I mean, these numbers seem to be off the scale, but it's clear that some big offensive is now being prepared, and with drones and aircraft and all of these things, it looks as if the advantage has turned decisively again in the Ethiopian government's favor.
All right, so I find this really interesting in that a few weeks ago you had this recording, this audio, which implicated some sort of, for lack of a better word, some sort of support or regime change being coordinated by the United States against the Ethiopian government. And the Ethiopian government looked like it was on the brink of collapse. As we said, the capital looked like it was definitely under an offensive, and it looked like it was about to be surrounded. And the prime minister, the government, uses this recording, uses PR diplomacy in order to rally, or at least this is how I'm looking at it, how I'm seeing it, in order to rally the support of various countries that want to prevent some sort of US-backed or US-supported regime change in Ethiopia. And they come in and they turn the tide of this thing to the point where most likely you even have some foreign military officials who are actually operating the drones embedded in Ethiopia itself. This is a fascinating turn of events, isn't it? And the fact that Turkey's involved, I mean, it shows that Turkey and even the UAE, that they're pushing back against US-supported, and I use the word regime change. It might not be the right word. Maybe you have a better word for it. Some sort of US-backed military offensive or US-backed regime change in Ethiopia. Even Turkey and the UAE are saying enough. Is that a correct way of looking at this?
I think you have described it exactly right. To be straightforward about this, and I here I have to admit, to not fully understanding this conflict at its outset. I'm not denying that it has internal causes, but clearly there was a regime change operation underway as well. There was some kind of regime change operation. The United States clearly was unhappy with the Addis Ababa government and wanted to change it. And it backed this militia in Tigray. It was curious in some ways that this militia in Tigray should have decided to, oppose the entire government of Ethiopia. It looks increasingly to me as if they were put up to do it, and that they were put up to do it because they thought they would get US help. And I have to say, it reminds me a little bit of Syria and the Syrian conflict. All these militias being used to target the government, in that case the government in Damascus, this time the government in Addis Ababa. Now, what happened in Syria was, of course, in 2015, Russia intervened and turn the tide. This time round, it wasn't just Russia. It's a whole coalition of different states. So China undoubtedly is involved because it seems their drones are being used, even if there's no Chinese personnel directly involved. And for all we know, they might be, but they must have green-lighted deployment use of their drones in Ethiopia. The UAE, the Gulf, some of the Gulf states, and of course we see Turkey too, where the government itself, I think, is nervous that it may too be targeted for regime change. And you see that a whole coalition of countries, the moment this recording appeared, rushed to stop what they clearly saw as a regime change operation. And it's worked. It's turned the tide. And it's turned the tide decisively and in a way that makes it look unlikely at the moment that this war is going to end in any other way than with an Ethiopian victory. Now, I ought to say, one of the most intriguing aspects of this story is how was that recording made? Who made the recording and who released it? I mean, I think it's inconceivable that it was the Ethiopian intelligence that did that. I doubt they have that level of sophistication, though you never know. But it seems much more plausible that it was done by an intelligence agency. It was made by the intelligence agency of a great power. They got wind that this meeting was going to happen. They bugged the place where it was happening. They provided the recording to the Ethiopian government. The Ethiopian government has circulated this recording to various governments around the world. Prime Minister Abiy has been on tours to various capitals, and he's been able to drum up support as a result. And you're absolutely right in saying the world is saying enough. The world has had enough, if I can put it like that. I mean, not just Russia now, as it was in 2015, but a whole coalition of countries, Turkey, which is of course a US NATO ally, and UAE, which is historically been a very strong ally of the US. What they're saying to the US, look, we're sick and tired of these games. They must end. We have no interest in them. If you're going to carry out regime change operations in countries like Ethiopia, well, we're going to oppose them.
That's the part that I have trouble kind of understanding. I mean, I get the great power conflict, the great power dynamics there between Russia, China, and the US and Ethiopia. Okay, the great powers, once again, as we saw perhaps in Cold War times, the great powers are there to see who can control who can have the most influence in the country or the region. So I can definitely see China, Russia, US involvement in Ethiopia. The part that I still can't quite understand is why would Turkey and the UAE, which have traditionally been, I mean, Turkey is NATO for God's sakes, have been allies of the United States. Why would they take the position against the United States in the case of Ethiopia? What is it for them to gain by doing such a thing? Or are they also just saying, you know what, we are now in a bipolar world, and we need to start hedging our bets and perhaps not aligning all the time with the West, but also at certain moments aligning ourselves with the rising power, and that is China in this instance.
Yeah.
Is that what's going on, or is there something else involved?
I think there's a strong element.
Money, arms sales.
Yeah. Money, arms sales. Pleasing the Chinese. Annoying the Americans. Bear in mind that Erdogan doesn't get on with Biden. I mean, he really doesn't. So, I mean, this has been, the Turks, not just Erdogan, were incredibly incensed by Biden's moves over Armenia, recognizing the events of 2015, the genocide that took place there, all that sort of thing. This has been a major concern for people in Turkey, and of course, Erdogan is aware that there's a grouping of neocons in the United States who are itching to overthrow him. So he's got that side. But there is another element, which is, of course, Erdogan is a man of grandiose ambitions. He's recently been trying to set up some kind of Turkish-African connections he does see Turkey as a kind of global power. He's been talking about the fact that the UN Security Council excludes countries like Turkey, which is inappropriate. And of course, he wants to be involved in every conceivable conflict because that's the way, as he believes, that he puts Turkey on the map. So this is his opportunity, in effect, to get himself involved in an important African country, Ethiopia, the country which hosts the African Union, which is based in Addis Ababa, and he can say that way to the African states, well, Turkey is your friend, we are an independent great pole of power, we've saved Ethiopia, so you should become closer to us. This is, as a grandiose politics. It's probably, again, way beyond Turkey's ability to sustain this. But, bear in mind that sending a couple of drones and their operators is a pretty cheap way of intervening in a conflict like this. Doesn't put boots on the ground. He doesn't put, Turkish troops actually in a position where they have to fight and, be at risk of death or capture. So, it's a sort of cheap way of gaining influence and gaining prestige and all the rest. Now, so I think that's the Turkish side of this. Now, if you're talking about the Gulf states, it's vitally important to understand that the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are, by the way, close allies, have been drifting increasingly into an ever closer relationship with China. Now, China is a major buyer of Saudi and Gulf oil. The US has recently apparently obtained satellite information that China is assisting Saudi Arabia in building missiles. China is providing missile technology to Saudi Arabia. And of course, the UAE also has a close relationship with China. So one must certainly think of Saudi Arabia and the UAE as US allies and friends, but they are also friends of China too. And very much like Erdogan, they don't like the Biden administration. MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is known to have a very bad relationship with Biden. And of course, the UAE is a bit different, but probably it's not very different there too. So at one level, they do want to develop their relationship with China, which is, as I said, an important market for them. It's the country probably which they see as the most important country for them in the future. And at the same time, they're angry with the US. And none of these countries anyway likes regime change. Unless, of course, it's a regime change they're trying to carry out.
Right. And finally, just on a final note, we didn't really hear much about Egypt in this conflict because Egypt has had tensions with Ethiopia with regards to, it's a water dispute with regards to the Nile. And they've had tensions with Ethiopia going on for the past couple of years. They didn't seem to throw their hat in the ring one way or another. At least that's from my understanding. Egypt kind of kept out of it. Now, I don't know if they're absorbed with dealing with Libya and they just don't want to deal with Ethiopia, but they seem to have taken just a hands-off approach. At least that's what I'm reading. I don't know if you have any other information on Egypt's involvement, but Egypt seemed to have just not been involved in this at all.
I have no other information. One would have expected Egypt to be involved, and indeed one would have expected Egypt to back the Tigrayans, precisely because they are so concerned about this dam. And it's fascinating to notice that that the Egyptians have played no role in this at all. Now, I'm going to make a guess that the Egyptians were given very, very strong warnings behind the scenes from various parties. China, obviously, but the Gulf states probably, but I suspect Russia also, to remain out, not to involve themselves in this particular conflict. Now, the Russians, I should say, they don't seem to have any personnel on the ground, but they have been diplomatically backing Abiy as well, the Ethiopian government. And it may not be entirely a coincidence that the Egyptian president, al-Sisi, has been having a series of conversations recently with Vladimir Putin. In fact, he just had one. He's just had one. And it could very well be that the Russians have been saying behind the scenes, look, under no circumstances become involved in Ethiopia. This is far too distant from you. You're going to come up against the Chinese. You're going to annoy your Gulf friends. We understand your concerns about the dam. We'll see what we can do diplomatically to help you with that, but under no circumstances become involved. And it seems that the Egyptians have chosen, possibly for that reason, not to become involved in this conflict. I think that's very wise.
Yeah, I agree. All right, we will leave it there. The Duran.locals.com, Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and Super User, where you will find our videos. And of course, go to the Duran shop. 10% off when you use the code Good Day on all merchandise. You have a Good Day mug with
Absolutely,
you, Alexander?
Obviously, of course. In fact, not just one. I've got two. I go to the gym later, so this is the one I take for the gym. This is the one I have here. And you've got your US mug, which is a phenomenal, wonderful mug. I have that one also. Mm-hmm.
All right, you can get 10% off on those mugs when you use the code Good Day. Take care, everybody.